I'm a senior vice president here at CSIS. Thank you all for being here. David Malpass doesn't really need an introduction. He's the former president of the World Bank. He's a former undersecretary of the Treasury. He got his start. He's a PhD economist. Okay. But you speak how many languages?
I'm a CPA.
CPA, how many languages do you speak?
Three, French, Russian, and Spanish.
French, Russian, and Spanish. But you got your start in Washington in 1984 working on the Kissinger Commission review of foreign assistance, right? So Henry Kissinger was long time affiliated with CSIS. I also remember David Malpass was also worked in the Latin America, the Western Hemisphere Bureau at the State Department in Bush 41. You were at Bear Stearns.
Treasury from 86 to 89. So that was the Brady Plan.
Yeah, I did the Brady Plan.
And Latin America was a giant focus of the U.S. then.
Then you were on Wall Street. So you then had, how long were you at the World Bank?
4 years.
4 years,
Yeah.
Okay. So I thought it was important that we have a conversation. David's my friend. David's been a partner to CSIS, and he's someone who's thought long and hard about issues of development. And he's thought long and hard about international finance. And I thought he'd be a really excellent person for us to have a conversation, given sort of the moment that we find ourselves in. So thanks, David, for agreeing to do this. I really appreciate it. So maybe we could start with Secretary of the Treasury Bessent gave a speech today about the future of the IMF and the World Bank. I'm sure you all maybe are aware of this. I haven't had a chance to kind of parse every single sentence, and I'm not going to hold you to it either. So this is like, could I just ask you, David, just to kind of reflect a little bit on what your initial impressions are, just having you and I both having had a chance to glance at the text. And
Dan, it's really good to be here and good to see CSIS and everybody here. I haven't read the whole speech. The issues are really important in the headlines that he's talking about mission creep and the expansion of the mission and encouraging institutions to focus on their mission. I think is really good, spot on. And so I'm glad that conversation is going forward.
And what you're saying is like have a division of labor. The IMF does some things and the World Bank does some other things, and they should stick to their knitting.
Yes, but it's beyond that. It's that as a mission, the IMF needs to think about actually having countries do well on their finances, which is gone way away from what they're doing. And for the World Bank to actually have a focus on having people's lives be better off in developing countries, especially in the poorer countries, and that's simply not happening.
I want to come to poor countries like Africa in a minute, because I know you have a special place in your heart for Africa and did a lot of work on Africa when you were World Bank president. And also when you were Undersecretary of the Treasury on initiatives like Prosper Africa, for example, as well. But I want to ask you about there's some reference in Secretary Bessent's speech on graduation policy for the World Bank. Could you just reflect, if I said graduation policy, World Bank discuss, not necessarily all the finer points of how he's looking at it, but you were in that job. How should people understand the issue of graduation policy?
Yeah, so IBRD, which is the upper tranche of lending by the World Bank, so it makes bank-like loans to sovereign countries. And as they do better, as their per capita income goes up, they're supposed to graduate. So Japan graduated
in 1968.
In 1968, and
yeah.
South Korea graduated, and that got them world acclaim for moving beyond the status where they needed World Bank loans. As it stands now, China has not done that, and so this is a valid issue to say, why is China still taking loans from the World Bank? So one complication that I'll just throw out for the World Bank is the loans, the better the credit quality of the borrower, that actually helps the World Bank, so it makes money on the China loans. Another thing to keep in mind is in the capital increase that was done in 2019, there was a substantial downsizing of China's borrowing, which I I proceeded with under the terms of that. And
Saying when you were undersecretary, saying like, if you want this money from the United States, you're going to agree
to have less lending to
Yeah.
China, which was underway. I don't know what the latest numbers show. And then also what we did was change the type of lending to China to be heavily focused on marine plastics. So that being a goal that the board and the world could support, to make a few loans to China. It's basically, I think, 4 per year, but they should stop. And Besant is exactly right.
So I'm trying to figure, I don't know what the development levels of Japan were in 1968, but I'm going to probably argue safely that the development levels of China of 2025 are well beyond the development levels of Japan in 1968. I'm just going to bet you all a steak dinner that's probably the case, right? Is that fair?
I think that's right. And it's time.
So why are
for
we
China.
Doing this? Yeah.
Well, and
I know why we're doing it, but yeah.
I think China should see it in its own interest. It is very wedded to the idea of thinking of itself as a developing country.
And
that
leading
kind of
the G77
justifies all of their persona. But the reality is, it's time for them to move on in the WTO, in the World Bank, and not be claiming not be using. They're actively using their special status as a developing nation to get better deals out of international. They should stop.
Yeah, so just a couple of things on that. One is, I think, David, tell me if I'm wrong, I think there was like a 99-0 vote in the U.S. Senate that said, please stop having China treat itself as a developing country. Someone can fact check me on that, but I believe it was 99-0, or it was 98-1, or I think it was 99-0, okay? So this is not like a controversial topic in the United States, but I do think it's an issue. Dr. Ngozi, who is the head of the WTO, who we've hosted here, I had this conversation with her a couple months ago, and she was saying to me that she was like, I understand and respect China's identity as a developing country. She's from Nigeria. She has a sensitivity to these issues. And I do think that China's as identity, this is important to their identity. And I think you were referring a little bit to that, David. But stop taking the bennies. So you can say I'm a developing country, but don't take the bennies. So you can say, and I'm relinquishing this because I'm as being a leader. So I think that's a good way to think about it. That's maybe a halfway house.
That's a way out of this, and it's constructive for everyone.
And so it's like a losing face.
Note, if China would stop lending, that means there's more available for other countries to borrow.
Okay, so two things.
There is a finite amount.
Right, there's $100 of lending envelope at the World Bank, and I don't know if the Asian Development Bank's still lending to China. I suspect they are too.
They are heavily.
But let's, for this conversation, say there's $100 that they lend out every year at the World Bank and $100 at the Asian Development Bank. If China's taking 10 of that, that's 10 less for everybody to kind of, for the system to think about. So so this is, David, I think that's your point. On the issue, the thing David said earlier is about, there's a lot of less creditworthy countries. So having a really, no one thinks China's going to default on a World Bank loan. And the World Bank also makes money on that loan. They borrow the money at 4%, and then they lend it to China at 5%, and that 1% is their revenue that keeps the lights on and pays the staff at the World Bank. So it's a business decision for them to, so part of it is they're motivated by business calculus at the World Bank because they run a bank, right? So this is hard for them from a financial incentive standpoint, right? That's what, right? Okay. All right,
But it needs to be done and
we got to cut it out.
It should be initiated by China. Let's see what they do.
Right. Anyway, so I've been in favor of this, and I think this is great. I agree. So Secretary Besant talked about that. I thought that was encouraging. I was really happy to see that he sort of reaffirmed American engagement and leadership. Bank and the IMF, that was also sort of...
I don't know. I haven't read how that phrasing.
Right.
I think there has to be a broader discussion of the U.S. of international organizations. They're simply too big, and they've had sprawl. They've had mission creep, but it's way beyond mission creep. It's just become a life of its own. And so there has to be a full, full upheaval of the the affirmation of the mission, of it being a narrower mission, and that means much smaller organizations.
So I think we should watch that space, because I think that we're going to see more on what you just said, I think, in the very near future is my guess. Let me push on a couple other things related to he makes some reference to nuclear power. If I said, I want to talk about nuclear power and I talk about energy in the developing world and the role of the MDBs in that. So if I said nuclear power, World Bank discuss, what's your reaction to that?
That's great. And whether they can do that, meaning can the World Bank help facilitate countries that are beginning to use nuclear power?
Yeah.
Philippines has been one that's been talked about. Can you actually have a project and put it through the board at the World Bank? I hope they can, and they should.
It's been like a taboo, right?
Well, because remember the historical cycle, the world kind of went against nuclear power. So they've got to really rethink that. That should have been rethought as people were wondering about climate and environmental issues. But for a host of reasons, you remember Germany closed their nuclear plants. Japan still has many of their nuclear power plants closed now. So you really need strong leadership, I think, by the U.S., because the threat or the difficulty is China is moving very quickly on nuclear power, and that means small modular reactors.
Yeah.
That means big reactors. They're building them fast, and so then they get more information. They get big data on how it operates, and they begin to capture an economy of scale.
Yeah.
So the U.S. has to move really fast. So I'm happy to see talk of the World Bank doing it, but I think the leadership has to come from the U.S. From France, of course.
Of course. So France and the U.S. are the big.
France is producing nearly 70%, some high number of their electricity from nuclear, and doing it successfully. So I think the U.S. should get moving.
World Bank, EBRD. You could also see some of the. I'll come back to the regional development banks, but you could also see regional development banks supporting nuclear power as well, right?
Yeah, I don't know their specific
how they look at this stuff,
what their policies are within their boards.
Okay. I want to talk about contracting. This has always been a pain point. The United States gives so much money to IDA, which is like the lower income lending for the poorest countries, and it's in the form of quasi grants that are making this up like 1% interest at over 30 or 40 years or something along those lines. And so we give a certain amount of money every year to that, and we've made capital investments into the IBRD, and then the United States said, well, how come other countries win contracts, or other countries are making more money off of this? What's your reaction to this issue? Because I know this isn't a Republican or I think a Democrat issue. I think this is just a perennial issue for the United States. How should the United States think about contracting as it relates to the World Bank? And what's your take on that?
Well, I want to broaden the point. What are useful ways to help finance development? And that gets you straight into the procurement issue. What's in it for you as a national interest? So what are U.S. interests in being the world's most generous nation? A lot of that goes through private foundations in the U.S. The rest of the world doesn't have anything in the same ballpark as that. So I think there has to be recognition globally of the huge role that that U.S. people are playing, a huge role they're playing in generous development within the world. Now, coming to the appropriations, this is being argued out on AID, how the U.S. Agency for International Development, how helpful are those loans? So in 1984, the Kissinger Commission had wondered about the effectiveness of U.S. programs in Central America to counter the Soviet Union. So
I was going to say the bad guys.
The really bad guys in the Cold War. And it was not providing the support that was needed. And these were critical reviews even then, and I think that's persisted to now. So this gets you straight into IDA. Is it better than, and the IDA is the International Development Association, is part of the World Bank. I was president of that organization. It makes grants and low interest rate loans to the poorest 75 countries. And so then you can wonder, can you do a better job using multilateral standards rather than the US? And I'm skeptical of that. So then you have to say, okay, what do you want to do as part of a development program where the US is a participant? And that gets you straight into what is the mission, and are you being effective in the mission? I'm skeptical of that.
All right, I want to talk about Africa. So I just joined the board of a new Africa Business Advisory Fund. I invested in it personally as well, started by a former U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, Ambassador Ruben Brigady from the Biden administration. I share his vision that we're going to have 2 billion African citizens. There's going to be more African citizens than citizens of China and India combined. I don't know if it's 400 million folks in Africa today are in the middle class. There's something like 800 million or a billion cell phones. We're within 2 to 3 years of 50% urbanization in Africa. This is an enormous, enormous business opportunity. I think we're sometimes a little bit behind the times in how we think about Africa in the United States. Not everybody. I think you're a person who's always, you've traveled, you know Africa well. How should the United States and how should the World Bank be thinking about Africa, and how should the United States be thinking about Africa?
It's really important to the world because of the population, because of the opportunities for markets for the U.S., the opportunity for resources, and the humanitarian interest that we have in the region doing well. The question is, how do you best interact with that? And so I was happy to see in Secretary Bessent's remarks the idea that the IMF has to be very focused on the mission of letting countries not be financially so deep underwater, which is the case. That the IMF has to, I think, change its programs and standards so that we don't keep repeating the problem. You know, Pakistan has had 24 failed IMF programs. So what do you really want to do another program? And what is your mission?
The 25th will work this time.
Well, let's hope the 25th. And so we see the poverty numbers across the developing world are higher, not lower. And so that means that what you're doing is not working. So I've wanted and recommended and tried to have a more focused approach on the things that governments are doing that harm their countries, try to stop those, and try to set in place things that will work. That means rule of law, that means sound money so that people can actually have some kind of dependability of their exchange. It means the government's not being too big. One of the problems, even in poor countries, is the governments dominate. And so everybody who's trying to do business has to go to the government. And a lot of times that gets right into corruption. And so having a strong global view that there has to be better practices in the governments that I think would help a lot. That's simply not happening right now. So we see littered across the world failed nations where the governments are failing in their primary interaction with their citizens. That's at the World Bank. I really wanted the World Bank to have people, because it has offices in many countries, to be thinking about, is this going to benefit the people of the country? Because so often what's happening is you're benefiting the consultants, you're benefiting the elites of the country, and it's leaving the people in deeper and deeper poverty. That's a giant
That's
problem.
a recipe for...
IMF did its forecast yesterday. You know, the global growth is slowing, and I think we have to look at that and say the systems that were in place are not working. That's the trade system, the central banking system, the fiscal systems, the relationship with the IMF and the World Bank. And we should talk about regional banks maybe too.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about regional development banks. I think the Asian Development Bank's a really important institution. I wrote a paper several years ago saying it as a strategic asset of the United States. I think one of the ways in which we engage in the Western Hemisphere is the Inter-American Development Bank, frankly, is a really positive institution. There's a, I think I'm the only person that read this book, but I read the history of the Inter-American Development Bank. The idea started in the 1880s, and it took from 1889 until 1959 for it to be fully, and a lot of the learnings in the attempts at creating the Inter-American Development Bank impacted the Bretton Woods process. So anyway, there's a book by a former Argentine executive director anyway, so I think these institutions matter. I think there's a role for a division of labor, but I'd be curious, David, I think there's some worry in some of these regional development banks. I've talked to a number of leaders in those institutions about how the United States thinks about regional development banks. I see this speech by Secretary Besson, I think, okay, we're going to continue to lead in the World Bank and IMF, and I'm happy about that. That's my headline takeaway from his speech. But tell me about the regional development banks. How should we think about them, given the conversation we've been having?
I wouldn't generalize, so there's so many of them.
Let's think about Asian Development Bank.
There's too many of them.
Okay.
And I want to point out, and I've written and talked a lot about this, preferred creditor treatment is a powerful attribute of what you're calling regional. So
explain to our television audience, what does that mean?
When these organizations make loans, unlike anybody else, they're guaranteed repayment. And so when there is a debt restructuring, as there have been periodically, as countries do poorly, sometimes under the advice of the international organizations, and they can't pay their debts, then they begin to restructure their debts. But a certain group of lenders doesn't take any of the losses. So it's a moral hazard because then it becomes more and more loans. And so that group of institutions is called IFIs, International Financial Institutions, and they enjoy preferred creditor treatment. So the problem here is you're naming some institutions that maybe they have a purpose and could clarify their mission and actually have a positive contribution beyond just the money that they're giving to the countries or lending to the countries. But there are now more and more. Every year there's another one of these. It crowds out private sector activity, so you fully lose the market-oriented nature of global capital flows. And so a lot of the activity going on in world that we call development is, rather than starting small businesses, what they're doing is trying to get loans from these organizations that have preferred creditor treatment. That means the country, the poor country, is locked in permanently. The people and their children and their grandchildren will be paying the interest on those loans. So even today, in Latin America, the CAF, CAF has been granted preferred creditor treatment. Where did that come from? And who granted that? And why should all of their loans that were questionable be guaranteed by U.S. taxpayers? And in
I'm not going to need a second cup of
Africa,
coffee. Thank you.
Exim Bank is asking for that status out of the blue, and there's a bank in Burundi that says we are a preferred creditor treatment. So we shouldn't have to be accountable for the types of lending that we're doing.
So what you're saying is they could and should and potentially do have a role, but there's probably a good spring cleaning it might be necessary.
Well, I think there has to be a clear definition of preferred creditor treatment, and if you did that, you would suddenly find that nobody will finance these organizations because they're only doing it. And let's be clear, China's a huge beneficiary of this system. They've set up in Shanghai and in Beijing two of these
New Development
organizations.
Bank and AIIB.
Yeah, the New Development Bank and AIIB that enjoy this status. And so that means that if you're the Chinese Communist Party, you're funneling money through them, and then it gets the same guarantee as the IMF and the World Bank for lending that is political in its nature.
Okay, so David, I've learned the people I've learned from the most about sovereign debt is my friend Rafael Romeo, who's leaving, who's the CEO. See you later. No, I'll see you in a second. He's going to join a panel, but he's the CEO of DevTech, and he was at the fund for 14 years, an economist. and he's an affiliate here at CSIS, and you. Those are the two people I've learned the most about the issue of there's a massive sovereign debt crisis in the developing world.
Yeah.
It's different from 40 years ago. China's the largest lender to the developing world today, and then there's a whole series of, I'm going to call them hedge funds or other kinds of private financiers, highly atomized. And so it's a much more complicated problem than, say, 40 years ago when you could get 12 people in a room over cigars and work this out during the spring meetings. So it's a much more difficult problem. And when I've talked to you about this, you know, your argument has been, Dan, having all this, you know, why is the sovereign debt crisis, why should the United States care about it? One is, what you've told me is, it means that countries have to, instead of spending $1 more on healthcare or $1 more on education or $1 more on a road, they're spending $1 more on paying interest to China or $1 more to a hedge fund. So that's not helping these countries grow. But second, if these countries are seen as kind of financial basket cases, they also are less attractive to investment other than, let's call them vulture investors in places like China, where they're afraid, you know, they're happy to invest in a super complicated place, and there's less American presence, there's less Western presence. Those are two things you've talked about. How the heck do we solve this really thorny problem?
Sure. Try to break it down.
Yeah.
So one part is that the debt as it stands today for some countries is unsustainable. So you need a system to restructure that at a lower level. That doesn't exist right now. And then second, you need principles going forward that you don't just keep doing the same mistake again. So we've tried to outline right here ways to solve this problem. It's just that the world incentives are not there. There's an international elite, call it a cabal, that wants to keep the system going because the interest is so good on these loans.
It's business. It's good for business.
If you're sitting in China, they haven't lost any money. If you're sitting in London or New York, these are hugely profitable undertakings to lend even to poorer countries, because when you make a mistake or when the clock strikes and the country is in trouble, you're going to get paid pretty well out of the restructurings. So we have, and you know, it's been now every 15 years or so. At the World Bank, I initiated and we did a book, the 4 waves of debt. So it went with the Latin debt crisis and the crisis of the 90s and the crisis of the 2000s. And now there's another one going on right now, a debt crisis where, because of the low interest rates, the countries were happily borrowing. The elites in the countries were borrowing huge amounts in the 2010s. Remember when interest rates back in the distant history, interest rates were 0 at the Fed funds rate and were very low for bonds. And so poor countries borrowed as much as they could, and now the interest rates have gone up. They have floating rate debt. One of the things I did at the World Bank was tried in 2020 and 2021 to get the countries to swap their floating rate debt into fixed rate debt with the bank. That means that it's just like with a mortgage. You go from a floating rate mortgage to a fixed rate mortgage. It made sense in the US. Lots of people did that. In developing countries, very few would do that because you had to pay a marginally higher interest rate on the fixed rate loan than the floating rate loan. So Colombia did it, Angola did it, but you know, I would call the finance ministers and the presidents of the countries, please won't you switch into fixed rate? It's almost with no fees. The World Bank wouldn't make money on it. It was just a neutral, and there weren't takers. So we're left with debt, and we're left with a debt restructuring process led by the Group of 20, where China is a dominant player within the Group of 20, and they they're doing restructurings that benefit the elites and not the people of the countries.
So
it's totally stuck, and it's been stuck. I mean, I
5 or
hate
6
to harp
years?
on this. I've been making the same comments for 5 years.
So I would argue that the technocratic route of making the economic arguments has failed. And I think, David, you're a person who appreciates politics, so do I. that it's going to require what I'm going to describe as presidential level attention. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, because the incentives for France, for the UK, for China especially, to do nothing about this problem are high. So if the U.S. led and said, we are going to see a way that the countries that have unsustainable debt are going to have a quasi-bankruptcy process where they can restructure the debt and then get a fresh start, that would be enough to do it. But
that's going to require. It's not something the head of the IMF can solve per se. It requires.
Well, the IMF could do it. But they say, and I don't know whether it could be challenged, that they are prohibited or prescribed. They're on the side more of the creditors, and so you've got to say who within this system actually wants to have benefits for the people of the developing country,
of the poor countries.
We're talking about Ghana and Zambia and Ethiopia and countries that have lower per capita incomes that borrowed too much in the 2010s. So who's going to be on their side? And the problem is most of the elites in the world are on the other side, trying to get interest off of those people.
All right. Okay, on that happy note. So David, thanks for doing this. Please join me in thanking my friend David Malpass. Thanks, David.